Shalom to everyone. Erev Tov, Shana Tova. A wonderful, sweet, and healthy year for everyone. Kamar Chatima Tova. My name is Zvi Leshem. I'm the director of the Gershom Scholem collection for Kabbalah and Hasidut and Hasidism at the National Library of Israel here in Jerusalem. And it's a pleasure for me to have a chat with Rabbi Professor Ariel Evan Mayse, who's assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University in California, and who also serves as rabbi in residence at Atik, the Jewish Maker Institute. Ariel has a doctorate in Hasidic studies, which he received in the Department of Jewish Studies at Harvard University. I must tell you that I watched him write his dissertation literally about 2 meters from me. It was okay. So before we needed social distancing, it was about 2 meters anyways in the Scholem library many years ago, not so many, a few years ago. And also has a rabbinic ordination from the Beit Midrash Ariel here in Jerusalem. Ariel is the author or editor of several volumes. And to note, in addition to the one we're going to be discussing tonight, I'd like to note his being co-editor of the 2-volume A New Hasidism, Roots and Branches, together with his teacher and colleague, Professor Arthur Green. And just literally in the last couple of days, Ariel published 2 new books, one in Hebrew and one in English. The English volume is an anthology entitled Hasidism, Writings on Devotion, Community, and Life in the Modern World, in Brandeis University Press. And right more or less on Erev Rosh Hashanah, in Hebrew came out the book Sfat Emet B'Sfat Ha'em, Sfas Emes in Mamalashin, published by Magnus together with Dr. Daniel Reiser, which deals with the comparison between the Sfat Emet of the Ger Rebbe that we know it as a book and the Yiddish manuscripts that Ariel and Daniel discovered and worked on together. Ariel is also working on a forthcoming monograph on the relationship between spirituality and law in Hasidism up until the beginning of the 20th century. So I would, in the interest of full disclosure, I would say, though, that Ariel, in addition to being one of the really upstanding, fine young scholars, up-and-coming fine scholars in Hasidism today, is also a good friend of mine. So I think we'll put that out there to begin with. I'm going to be asking Ariel a number of questions about his new book on the Mageed of Mezrich. Sometimes I'll ask a couple of questions at once and let him sort of discuss them at the same time, or however he sees fit. Sometimes I'll stick with one question at a time. And let's get started. Okay, so your book, Ariel, is primarily about the theory of language in the Mageed of Mezrich. So I'd like to start with a sort of a general question. How would the Mageed understand the use of language as a way to let's say, bridge the gap between the human mystic and God? And I'll throw in sort of to add to that, is this, what are the limits of language in this sense? We're familiar with William James's writing about the ineffability of the mystical experience. It's something that by definition can't be expressed. How does that fit in here as well?
Thanks, Zvi. At the risk of one hand washing the other, I would say that we have this old tradition in Judaism of liftoach, the shivcha shel achsania, to start with some nice words about the people who are hosting you. And I would say not only do I have many friendships that have grown out of my time in the Scholem collection, this book never would have been, had it not been for the 4 years that I spent often 6 days a week sitting with the books in the Scholem library, speaking with its incomparable staff, and with the wonderful people that I met there. It truly could not have been otherwise. Now, to your very fine question, I guess in a certain sense, I would pivot and say as follows. When I was thinking about what am I going to write my dissertation about, I knew that I wanted to write about the Mageed. I wanted to write about the person who is at the heart of early Hasidism. And I started reading his books, or the books that are attributed to him, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And time and time and time again, no matter what the drasha is about, he comes to issues of language. We know this from Hasidic sermons. Sometimes there are people that they have a particular theme, and no matter what the parsha is, no matter what they're talking about, they're going to get to that critical theme. And for the Mageed, that's language. Time and again, he comes back to the question. And it's really the central theme in his teachings. It's really the central theme that links together every dimension of his mystical theology. So language for the Mageed is a bridge, as you put it. It's a way of moving from the world of the finite to the world of the infinite. Language is a divine gift, breathed into the human being at the very earliest moments of the formation of the human. But it's more than that. Language is the nature of the cosmos. God speaks the world into being, and human beings have access to that quality of language, that kind of reverberation of divine language that inheres in the physical world, that kind of echo of divine language is the human tongue. And he's very clear about this, and he uses a somewhat convoluted way of saying this. He calls it Olam HaDibur, which refers to the world of speech, the sphira of Shekhinah, of Malchut, and the link between those is already very clear in medieval Kabbalah, in the Tikkunei Zohar and elsewhere, but he uses it in a somewhat more devotional sense. The point there is that when the human being speaks, it's the human voice and the divine voice articulated at the very same time, and you can't fully disambiguate them. Human speech is divine speech, and the other way around is also true. Human beings give speech to that silent, infinite, divine. Now, many of us who are students of mysticism have read William James, we've read Evelyn Underhill, we've read many works that talk about the ineffability, the inability to speak about God, the inability to describe God. Now, for the Mageed, that's true up until a certain point. But what the Mageed does is create a sophisticated contemplative path in which you never relinquish a foothold in the world of language, even as you step into the infinite realm beyond, or perhaps better, infinite realm within. Because for the Mageed, it's not about going somewhere else, it's about following one's words as they are articulated into the deepest seat of human consciousness. So rather unmooring oneself from language, language becomes a kind of inward ladder that you climb up. You don't cast it away. You never relinquish it. Language is precisely that bridge, which allows you to shuttle forth between these different modes of speaking and stepping into that quiet realm that is beyond language, and then back to language. And it's primarily, and this is important, the oral dimensions of language.
Thank you. That would seem to touch on a deep theological issue, which is the tension between immanence and transcendence in early Hasidic thought. Do you want to address that for a moment and how that's connected to language?
Yeah. You might say that one of the bedrock messages of the Baal Shem Tov, and almost all the sources are in agreement on this, is the immanence of God. Right? That's really core to what the Baal Shem Tov was teaching. Now, the Mageed absorbs that from the Baal Shem Tov, the immanence of the divine within the physical world, and the immanence of God within language. This is a core teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. Now, what's so interesting about the Mageed is that he will give these very abstract descriptions of God. For the Mageed, and this is a difference between him and the Baal Shem Tov, God is ayin. God is infinite naught. The infinite nothing, the infinite sweep of divine wisdom is described as that which cannot be named. And it's very abstract. And this chokhmah, or this ayin, or this nothing, or this wisdom undergirds everything. And you can almost see people in the audience sort of like scratching their heads. And so he'll say, Mashal lama hadavar dome, how can I get this message to you? Here's a description of a parent and a child. Here's a teacher and a student. Here's a very earthy sort of metaphor. And that kind of metaphor is something that he takes very seriously. Arthur Green often says that he and his teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, both read the Mageed, and they read the Mageed in opposite ways. Arthur Green got all the immanence, and Abraham Joshua Heschel got all the transcendence. And I think, like most great thinkers, the Mageed had both. And he had this kind of complex theology in which God is both infinite and abstract, living within the seat of human consciousness and also stretching as a kind of unifying force, a vital impulse that unites all being. And yet, at the other hand, he is well within the culture in which the Yiddish proverb of describing prayer as the act of grabbing God by the beard is a part of their daily life, and they don't give up on that metaphor. And that metaphor actually appears in one of the works of the Mageed's disciples as a way of describing prayer. You grab God by the beard. And of course, they know that God doesn't have a beard. It's not about that. But it's about, and it's a metaphor for the way in which we use language. It's the way in which the vast symbolic register of medieval Kabbalah and the imaginative parables from the world of Hasidism are kind of like you might say, a house of cards built along the fault line or the threshold of human language. And they don't commit themselves to believing that those images are true in the deepest sense, but they're useful and they kind of spin a gossamer around that infinite and otherwise unspeakable divine.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned the parables of the son and the father and the teacher and child. Maybe we'll come back to those later. But I want to go back to something that you touched on briefly and ask you to speak about it a bit more, which is the whole relationship with and comparison with or between the Mageed and the Baal Shem Tov. And I'll mention a couple of points that you can relate to whichever you choose. And first of all, can we say that we have a theory of language of the Baal Shem Tov in a developed way that could be compared with that of the Mageed? And if so, what are the points of comparison and of difference? Secondly, this you didn't mention, but in the book you make the claim, I think, that the Mageed is I think you use the words more or less, the real founder of Hasidism, which of course flies in the face of certainly the popular conception, but I think in some ways also the academic conception that in some way or other the Baal Shem Tov, knowingly or not knowingly, is the founder of Hasidism in some sense that came to develop to be what we know of. If the Mageed is the founder, what is the role of the Baal Shem Tov? And what are the roles of the Baal Shem Tov's other leading disciples, like the Degel Machne Ephraim, his grandson, or the Toldot Yaakov Yosef, who are much more important than the Mageed, it would seem, in bringing down the traditions of the Baal Shem Tov. And lastly, you talk a lot in the introduction about the famous story, which has many versions, of the meeting between the Baal Shem Tov and the Mageed, which is an amazing story in its many versions. In all of them, there's a transition from the Mageed's prior intellectual path in learning Kabbalah to the Baal Shem Tov's more experiential approach. And I'd like to know in what way you see that experiential approach being continued in the teachings of the Mageed.
All right. So in answer to the question of whether or not we have a theory of language in the Besht, in the Baal Shem Tov, anytime I think we start the sentence, do we have a theory of in the Besht? The answer is going to be no. What we have doesn't give us that fullness of expression. What we have from the Besht are teachings and traditions that are sometimes in shorthand, it feels like. Sometimes it feels like they've been embellished. And figuring out exactly what he said and what he doesn't say is very, very complicated. Now, one of the only documents that we have from his hand is this letter that he sends to his brother-in-law. And that letter, at least in some versions, though not in all versions of it, describes God's immanence in human language. And he says to his brother-in-law, there are all these amazing things that I saw and I can't tell you about them because you can't really handle it and no one can handle it. But this I can tell you. Have this kind of intention to do these yichudim, or these unifications, in everything that you say when you are learning and when you are praying. This is the sort of fundament, because that creates a unity between the different divine spheres. But if you begin to triangulate within the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, not to try and build a coherent theory, but to see, are there sort of nitzotzot, or sparks of ideas that come together? Then divine immanence within human language is certainly one of them. The description of God's presence in the cosmos as language which of course is a rereading of the opening chapters of Genesis via the medieval Kabbalists. It's got a long history, but that association of the sparks that fall down after the breaking of the vessels, and the letters of Torah and the letters of divine speech, what have you, if that isn't an innovation of the Besht, it's certainly pretty close to. He's the one that really makes that popular. And the other very critical thing that you begin to see in the Baal Shem Tov is the opening to sanctifying ordinary speech. Sichat chulin, ordinary speech, not secular speech, but ordinary speech, mundane speech acts, in the same way that, in the famous parable, in the famous story, painting a wagon wheel can be a holy act, drawing water from the well can be a holy act, so too ordinary language can be a holy act. So those are the sort of fundaments of what we find in the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov that then get carried forward in the Mageed. Now, it's immediately striking to anyone who opens up the Mageed's books after having read the Toldos, after having read the Degel Mechane Ephraim, after having read someone like the Kamarna, for whom the Baal Shem Tov and the traditions of the Baal Shem Tov are really front and center. The almost near lack of quotations from the Baal Shem Tov or citations of ideas in his name is quite striking. Now, there are a couple of explanations for that, and I think somewhere in between them, it's probably true. One is that the hagiography, at least the earliest strata, suggests that they only met twice or three times. It's a small number. And those later legends of him staying for a very long time, or those legends for him going all the time to visit his teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, seem like they are expansions trying to fill in what's a very noticeable gap. Now, we've all had the experience of having the kind of teacher that you don't have to hear more than one class in order for your paradigm to be changed. It can be a lecture, it can be just a conversation after a lecture, someone into whose presence you go and who fundamentally changes the way that you see the world. And it seems like that's what happened with the Mageed. He met the Besht, and perhaps we'll talk about that story in just a moment, and everything changed for him, except for the things that didn't. And there is this thread of ambivalence that you find in the Mageed, who is a pietist of the old school toward the physical world, even after the Baal Shem Tov says to him, perhaps not in these words, rather than that, you should be emphasizing joy. Rather than that, you should be serving God through the physical world. Now, I can extrapolate that because that's exactly what the Baal Shem Tov says in a letter to his other disciple, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, saying like, didn't we go over this? Haven't you gotten it yet? It's not about the fasting. It's not about that. It's about other modes of religious service. The Mageed, one of the reasons that I describe him as the founder or the architect of Hasidism is that he is the Mechilat Kavodo, in a certain sense, like Paul. He is one of the early people around this charismatic teacher. He's not the only one. He's not the only one with an authentic claim. And in some ways, he's not the one with the deepest claim. He's not the one that's been there the longest. He's not the one who has a huge body of teachings, but he does something else. He has a kind of vision, and that vision has theological dimensions, and that vision also has sociological dimensions. And that's true for what the Mageed establishes in Mezrich at some point in the 1760s. The Degel Machane Ephraim is both a creative theologian and someone who seems to have been committed to the idea of passing on the legacy of the Baal Shem Tov. The Toldos Yaakov Yosef, both the editor of that book and he understood that one of the great sort of virtues of that work was the fact that there were hundreds of citations of the Besht. Sometimes it was in his name, sometimes it was just something he heard in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, sometimes he quotes it in one place and he doesn't quote it in another, right? It's a big mess. But that sort of close linkage is very important. And for the Mageed, you get the sense that this is someone who has taken those ideas and begun to spin them out, has begun to unfold them, has begun to try and figure out what they might mean. And he's not a systematic theologian. That will be not the strength of Hasidism at any point, but it will be left to certain among his disciples who are more interested in that kind of way of thinking. But he will begin to create a homiletical vision of what that looks like. Now, the story in which he meets the Baal Shem Tov, and you're right, there are versions of that from very early, and there are versions of that from very late, and they're all interesting. But the earliest versions seem to have everything that those later versions have in sort of inchoate form, that the Mageed goes for some reason to visit the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov gives him some sort of a almost flippant or nonsensical response when he gets the Mezhbush. The Mageed gets ready to go home, and he's called to visit the Baal Shem Tov. And he goes and he does, and there's some Kabbalistic book in the earliest versions. It's a book of medieval Kabbalah that's not what we would consider in the sort of mainstream, and that's probably authentic, given what we know about the Devised. And it's a book of the Hechalot sources, which also makes sense because those are experiential kinds of journeys that you take through the mystical arenas. And the Baal Shem Tov asks him to read it, explain, does it, but doesn't do it correctly for whatever reason, does this 2 or 3 times. And at least in one of the versions, the Baal Shem Tov then says, you, Berushcha nachon, like what you said is correct, aval halimud shelcha haya b'li neshama. Your explanation and the way that you studied it was without soul, right? It's like that great scene in Enter the Dragon when Bruce Lee tells his student, now once again, with feeling. And that's the moment where, at least according to the stories, the Baal Shem Tov has communicated something to the Mageed, which is that it's actually about something. And it's this kind of reconstruction of a religious personality around that notion of experiential devotion. And that very much is something that lifts off the page of the Mageed's works. It's harder to find in those elaborate sermons. It's very clear to find, clear to see in the Hanhagot literature, which Greece and others have really shown us how deeply important that is. There you find an almost forthright description of what religious experiences can look like. And every once in a while, in the works of the disciples more, you get firsthand accounts of what it was like to study with the Mageed, or what it was like to be when the Mageed was praying, or what it was like to do this around the Mageed, or be there. And there too, there is this deep experiential dimension.
Right. Beautiful. Thank you. You've raised a number of issues that I'll try to come back to, but I have to try to divide them up into pieces. I want to go back to language, and you mentioned both in terms of the Baal Shem Tov and the Mageed, the idea of the holiness of ordinary conversations, or the sanctification of Sichot Chulin.
Mm-hmm.
The language, the idea of the holiness of language would seem to expand the boundaries of the sacred. And one would think that this would have some impact on the view of avodah b'gashmiut, or service of corporality. And yet it seems that the Mageed, you mentioned, has an ambivalence towards this world. So on the one hand, he seems to have a very positive attitude towards language as a means of expanding the holy, but when it comes to practice, in terms of worldliness, his ascetic traditions don't ever seem to fully leave him, and there seems to be an ambivalence that remains as well. I think we see this also in the Noam Elimelech, who's his disciple. But we'll stick now in this generation. How would you address the relationship between language and the physical in general for the Mageed?
So, as I said, I really think that this question of ordinary speech being sanctified is a really important one. It's something that's developed more fully in the writings of the Mageed's disciples and in the sort of next generation, before you find a real clear confrontation with, let's say, modernity, even though it's a really problematic term, with sort of impulses toward reform, and when Jews are forced to change their language or forced to change their names or things like that, there's a real push within the Hasidic canon to go against those reforms, and we all know that. However, in this sort of intermediary period in the 1780s and 90s, at least in the sort of heartland of Hasidism, there's a really remarkable openness to sanctifying ordinary language, and they're fairly clear that it's not just about Hebrew, and it's not just about Yiddish. It's about language as such, as we would call it. Durkheim, is famous for his definition of religion as the infrangible distinction in between the sacred and the profane. That's the only thing that all religions all over the world have in common. Now, obviously, that's deeply problematic, and it's just totally not helpful for thinking about Hasidism, because Martin Buber's definition of Hasidism as having the sacred and the not yet sacred is actually really good. It's a really good way of understanding the expansive dimension of early Hasidism. And speech factors into that. Now, it's interesting, there aren't that many Kabbalistic precursors for this way of thinking, right? Abulafia describes the language trees in which Hebrew is at the very center, and he does gematria in other languages. But thinking about the sacred nature of other languages, at least to my knowledge, it's not a great preoccupation of the medieval Kabbalists, who are by and large committed to the singularity of Hebrew. Maoz Kahana actually pointed this out to me, that there are echoes of Sabbatianism in this, and I don't think that this is something that people have really followed up on. Shabtai Tzvi is known for having sung songs in the vernacular and have treated ordinary languages as being capable of being raised up. There's a lot of debate about the relationship between Hasidism and Sabbatianism, and this one actually seems like it might be an interesting way of thinking about it that's not just about were they antinomian, they weren't antinomian, which is a very boring conversation. Now, it's there in the Baal Shem Tov, and he doesn't totally efface the differences between religious language and ordinary speech. He talks about different sort of levels of yichud, or different kinds of levels in which there are these unifications that are happening. But the Mageed is fairly clear that all language, including Hebrew, but not only Hebrew, is an echo of this divine language. And it's a very, very profound break with the medieval Kabbalists, even though he doesn't describe it as such. Now, you're right that that is then so interesting, that if language is the nature of being and the nature of the physical cosmos, and all language can be sanctified, then the next part of the syllogism should be that all physical acts can be sanctified. And he does go there, and he does say that on occasion. But one of the things that's so interesting and so difficult about studying the Mageed is that there is a fundamental lack of coherence in his teachings, because there are so many, and they're attributed to him. He didn't write them down. And I think more than just people getting it wrong or people getting it right in the transcriptions, what that shows us is the sort of fault lines or the ambivalences that you find in the Mageed. And there is something that he never abandons about his ambivalence toward the physical world. And I think that has to do with his introspective religious personality. Chaviva Padaya has written about this. It has to do with his deep, I would say, sort of mistrust of pleasure, of the kind of physicality of the human, of the corporeal world, and the pleasure that it can bring. And he never sheds that. He never sheds that. And some of his students, the Noam Elimelech being one of them, and a very good example of it, also absorb that. They don't attack Avodah B'Gashmiyut on any sort of theological grounds. They're all for it in a certain theoretical sense. But there's another part which is to their legacy, which is that there is a fear that that can devolve into self-interest, a kind of celebration of physicality. They're, before the Mitnagdim levy those claims about the Hasidim hanging out in the warm mikveh and eating bagels all the time and saying that they're serving God. It's not exactly the example, but it's more or less the example. Like, they're alert to the way in which that can actually take you away from Avodat Hashem, take you away from the service of the divine.
I hadn't actually planned to ask you this now, but it just came up to me hearing you now in terms of the way you describe the contemplative nature. One of the main people who wrote in great detail about the Mageed in his school was, of course, Rivka Schatz Zuffenheimer, who compared him to Christian quietism, obviously. Do you want to just say a couple words about that description and how it fits into the way you describe the Mageed now?
Yeah, I mean, that book is a real tour de force, and it's the kind of book that literally just lives on my desk because it's so interesting and so important. On the other hand, the deep issues with that book have to do in the way in which she doesn't separate between the Mageed's thinking and the others at his court. And that is a problem with a lot of early Hasidism. Scholars from Margolin and the late Tzipi Koifman have all moved in this direction of trying to isolate individual voices, which has been really helpful. But but that remains an issue in the world of the scholarship of early Hasidism. But a bigger issue with that book is the way in which either her preconceptions or perhaps that paradigm itself leads her to emphasize a kind of spiritualist impulse, which she's very careful to say never really wins out, but it's a spiritualist impulse that leads to two things. One is that the Mageed and the members of the Mageed circle, at least the more radical among them, are not really interested in the life of the mitzvot, because those just take you away from real contemplation. And the other is that they yearn to sink into ineffable silence. And she says, no, they never quite do that. And there are actually differences between the Christian Kabbalists, between the Christian Quietists. But when you get there, you don't quite believe her in the sense that that's what she's really arguing. And the way in which it is structured is really trying to fit Hasidism into this paradigm of mystica or mysticism, which in some ways that it inhabits it very well. And in some ways it's a really poor fit. And so by trying to emphasize the way in which the Mageed embraces language and sees it as not only as a divine gift, but as constituent of the cosmos and constituent of all being, language is not something to be shirked or to be avoided, but rather to be embraced, and seeing it more as a kind of dialectic in between ineffability and language, rather than a yearning for that kind of deep transcendence.
Great. Let's speak a moment about something that's come up again and again in our talk, but in and of itself, which is more the community side of things on several levels. First of all, we do have an early description, of course, of Solomon Maimon of the Mageed's court. I think you speak about in the book about the Mageed being kind of the first, the founder of the idea of the Hasidic court, which became such a central institution in all later development of the movement. But how does the idea of community fit into the Mageed? How does this play out also in terms of both theologically and sociologically, as you mentioned, in terms of in terms of his students? He has a wide variety of students who later on go on to really spread the Hasidic movement, either as intentionally, as has been thought in the past, or not so intentionally, as Art Green has argued more recently. If you want to say a couple of words about some of his students, who are is there a more authentic one? I think today we see in Chabad, for example, as a huge project of reprinting all of the Mageed's books, that there's almost what some people might call a kind of cultural appropriation going on, of putting him, in the straight line between, the Baal Shem Tov of the Mageed and then the 5 Nisim of Chabad. And of course, you have the whole school of Rishon, which are the direct descendants of the Mageed, but aren't really present at the early stages when he's forming his whole community. So whatever you want to say about the community and the players in the community and the legacy of that community, I'd love to hear.
Wow, thanks, Zvi. Yeah. So the description that Maimon gives is a really remarkable one. It's remarkable for a lot of reasons. It's remarkable for its detail. It's remarkable for the fact that it's published some 20-ish years after the fact. It's a little bit longer. And it's published for a Western European audience at first, and then it's eventually translated into Hebrew, but it's really for German-speaking Jews, and it's about his sort of intellectual autobiography and his time with the fellow travelers in the town of Em, which is obviously the town of Mezrich. David Saf, Weiss, and others have shown that it's a useful historical document, and it's a useful theological document, because we have ways of cross-referencing the teachings that he recalls there, and we see them in books that he wouldn't have had access to, or at least probably didn't have access to, which means that we have sort of independent witnesses of the teachings that he recalls, and we have them elsewhere, which strengthens the fact that he is giving us at least a useful perspective, if not an unbiased perspective. This is further strengthened by the fact that he then describes when he is in Berlin, giving sort of extemporaneous philosophical discourses, almost in the style of the Mageed that he has described. Itzik Melamed pointed that out to me. I would never have otherwise seen it. Now, the Mageed is there described as a great performer, not in the negative sense, but in the positive sense, as someone who understood the power of ritual, and someone who understood the power of creating an experience. And when he comes into the table and he's dressed in all white and he sings a certain somber song and he gives the sermon where he weaves together psukim or verses or rabbinic teachings from all of the attendees and somehow creates a seamless homily out of them. That already is an astonishing feat, and it's a fun game to play at the Shabbat table. But it's also the most remarkable thing that Maimon says, the most remarkable thing is the fact that everyone found in their particular verse or particular rabbinic teaching that they had volunteered, they found something to be of personal meaning. And this, he said, is astonishing. Because the secret that they wanted to get, the sort of wisdom that they were there to receive, they did receive, but they received it in public, spoken to with that kind of authentic voice. And we have reflections of that in the teachings of the Mageed. There's a famous passage, Rivka Schatz highlighted this, and so have many, many others, that the Mageed tells one of his disciples, I'm going to tell you the best way to speak Torah. You have to forget yourself, and the moment you start to hear yourself, then you got to stop because you're not really saying God's words. That's a famous teaching. It's influential in later Hasidism. It's influential in the teachings of the Jose of Lublin, and amongst the many others. It's influential perhaps in the story that is often told about Rebbe Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, who, when they brought a copy of his sermons to him just before his death, he is said to have torn out the page of every homily that he remembers having given, because if he remembers it, it's not the real thing. So I'm sure that this is, reflective of something very deep in the Mageed's consciousness, which is that Olam HaDibur, the world of speech, is not something that you can simply always control. It's a kind of divine automatic speech. But he also understood the importance of intentionality in speech, and that is something that doesn't happen. That's something that is made to happen. And the Mageed is described by one of his disciples, in fact, by the same disciple, just elsewhere in that book, in a passage that's somewhat less famous, as having once given the following parable. It's plucked from the Gemara, of a man who has two wives. And the old wife plucks out all of his black hair, and the young wife plucks out all of his white hair, right, trying to make them more age appropriate. And then the person ends up bald. Now it's there in the Gemara, but it's actually in Aesop's fables, equally unpolitically correct in both places. Probably the Mageed got it from the Gemara. The way he then understands that is, he says, this is what happens when a teacher walks into a room. There are the sort of the young whippersnappers who need one thing. They're at the very beginning of their Avodat Hashem, and they need one very particular kind of message. They need someone to castigate them. They need someone to sort of keep them in line. They need someone to give them divrei musar, right? And the others who are more veterans, they've been there, they understand something, they can sink into a different kind of modality of the service of God. And someone who is faced with two very different audiences at the same time can either talk to no one, which is a very common experience. They can be stunned into silence. Having been a teacher now for a lot of years, I can definitely relate to that, feeling like I'm here to do one thing, and then all of a sudden the audience is in two very different places, and I don't know exactly how to address either of them. And then he says the Chacham HaKolel, which is this great, really redolent medieval phrase, a person with a kind of expansive wisdom can speak one thing, and the people will hear what they need to hear. Now, it's remarkable that the stories and the teachings and the testimonies in the disciples almost all speak to this ability, that the Mageed was someone who spoke on multiple levels at the same time. Now, the reason that I find that to be so interesting is not only it's something that preoccupies me as a teacher, and it's not only something that preoccupies me as trying to understand his theory of language, it's also, in a certain sense, a helpful paradigm for adjudicating this question as to, in the emergent school of the Mageed. And here I think Rivka Schatz, who comes out on the side of saying there is such a thing as the school of the Mageed, I think she's entirely right. And the reductionist impulse to try and say, no, there really was nothing, it can go too far. I think that what Ada Rappaport said about there being no centralized leadership and no clear kind of Yerusha going from the Baal Shem Tov to the Mageed, it's not about a kind of clear lineage. I think that's totally, totally correct. But on the other hand, there is a cluster of voices and a cluster of ideas and religious personalities that we don't know exactly how often they were there. Sometimes they were only there once. We have one description of someone who exists within multiple Hasidic circles as having spent one Shabbat in Mezrich. Sometimes they may have been there more than once. We don't really know. However, they seem to have been shaped by that experience, and they keep up correspondence with one another. And there is a kind of mutual exchange. And indeed, as Arthur Green has argued of late, and this is something that I am also partial to, and he and I are writing a book together about this, if you read the sermons carefully, there's a kind of internal debate going on over key issues of devotion, in which very real differences that continue into the present day begin to emerge. Now, one of those or the other of those is not any more or less authentic. There are certainly those who...
Can you give us one example, perhaps?
Sure. I mean, this is a great example of what happens when the Tanya is published. And there is this debate between Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who is the author of that book, and Rabbi Avram Cohen of Kalisk, over what's really going on there. And the Kalisker says a couple of things. One, he says, you've you'll forgive me, sort of churched up the teachings of the Mageed in Lurianic garb, and you've given us this overwhelming supply of language. And he says that too much oil, right, will put out the candle. And he says that you've also styled your model of leadership on something that the Mageed wouldn't have agreed with. So it's like 3 different points. Now, in a certain sense, he's right on all of them. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi is doing systematic theology to a certain extent. He has created a more Lurianic form than what we have in the teachings of the Mageed. And it is true that the idea of the tzaddik and the social placement of the tzaddik vis-a-vis the other people is different in what you find in Chabad, or what's becoming Chabad in those years. Now, on the other hand, I see that Dr. Kalish is here. There is this thread of Lurianic Kabbalah that goes back to the Baal Shem Tov and is certainly there in the writings of the Mageed. And it's almost certain that there's a lot more that we just don't have because we have these written testaments. There's a huge amount of material that was certainly lost. And I'm sure that there was a much deeper engagement with other kinds of Lurianic sources that we're just not privy to. And in terms of the sort of prolixity of the Tanya, or the fact that it is an overflowing of wisdom that was best meant kept secret, as opposed to kept to the particular sort of small chuvah, or the small community. There are impulses in the Mageed which go in both directions, which is one, it's a kind of unique relationship between the master and the disciple, and it's meant to be kept for a very small circuit of elites. And then on the other hand, he has this expansive vision in which people are meant to go out and people are meant to share this message with other people. And I think that that's just, it's sort of like, you might say, you'll forgive me, Tzvei Dinim in the Mageed, it's sort of 2 different elements that exist. And in the Mageed, they coexist, and each one of the disciples picks up one through line of that and makes it into their central melody.
Great. Let me ask you, we're a couple more questions. The end is in sight, but I do have a few more issues I'd like to get through with you. You, in your introduction as well, speak about the relevance of the Mageed to yourself as a teacher, and you teach at Stanford, which is obviously a leading and very secular institution, and you describe yourself as teaching from a humanist perspective. Now, you are a rabbi, so usually Orthodox rabbis and humanists, there's a question of how those two go together, what you mean by the language. So how does the Mageed fit into your teaching? And I'd like to combine that with another question, which I think is relevant, although you may want to separate them. Going back to the whole language issue, many of us are very well aware of the famous letter of Gershom Scholem to Franz Rosenzweig, where he expressed his concerns about the secularization of the Hebrew language, which is a very modern phenomenon tied up with the Zionist project and Israeli culture today. So how do you put together for yourself, let's say, as a professor at Stanford, and I know dealing with students, Jews and non-Jews, religious and non-religious, and all kinds of spiritual seekers perhaps, but at Stanford, how does all this fit together for you in terms of the language considerations and the humanistic and spiritual impulses at the same time?
Yeah, when I moved to Stanford after teaching at Hebrew College, where I was teaching future rabbis, people asked me, "Oh, so how does that change your teaching?" And I don't know if it's for the better or the worse, but it really doesn't. In a certain sense, there are things that you can say, and there are things that you can ask of your students that are very different in a rabbinical school than there are in a secular university. But in terms of trying to lead my students through multiple layers of meaning in a text, trying to first figure out on historical, philological, textual grounds, what's going on in this text, and then trying to understand the associative dimensions of how does this speak to other sources of that particular tradition. Then going deeper and trying to figure out what's the sort of human question at the heart of this text. And that's a hard jump to make, moving from just intellectual history or understanding things in their particular socio-religious context. What is this text about? And the Mageed's language is very obscure. The Mageed's language is very difficult to sort of get behind in terms of understanding that there are bigger issues at play here. And that's why this framing of what is language and what is the nature of human language becomes a very helpful way of allowing students to find their way into a text. Because if I come out of the gate and start talking to them only about, well, you see, Olam HaDibur has its roots in the Perush of Rabbi Ezra Megerona to Shir HaShirim, and then there's this like sort of transformation that happens with the Tikkunim. That's the stuff that I can put into the Hebrew edition of this book. But that's not the stuff that I can lead with in my classroom. And helping students find their way into questions of deeper meaning. And these are not simply personal questions, but these are the questions that those who are trained in the humanistic disciplines learn how to ask of their sources, be they philosophical, be they religious, be they literary. There are different forms of those questions. That's something that I very much try and get my students to understand. And I have a wide range of students, Jews, non-Jews, spiritual seekers from all over, as you've said, a lot of people with literally no awareness of religion who grew up. Some of my students now grew up in secular homes. They were born in 2002, 2003, and they don't know the world of religion. And it is, first of all, an effort to try to get them to see that these texts are not only are they important to understand to be an educated human being. Like that's one thing. It's another thing to understand that these are very important for shaping people's worldviews. That's another. But the third level is trying to say these texts, whether or not you are a part of this tradition or you consider yourself a card-carrying member of a Hasidic community is not the question. How do these texts speak to what it means to be a human being? And to do that without denaturing them and saying, oh, well, look, well, the Mageed is really actually a universalist. Like that's also not what I'm going to find there. And accenting the problems of that legacy and all the complexities of it are really important. But being able to solicit or elicit that kind of reading is a very useful exercise. Now, that letter that you mentioned of Scholem to Rosenzweig is a great letter. It is, indeed, it's about the ambivalence toward the secularization of language. It's interesting. It's about that, and it's about more, which is that it's the fear of the young Scholem that the anarchic vital religious impulses within language can't be fully tapped down. And either there will be a re-explosion of religious energy, or language will become so destroyed that that vital impulse will wither. And if you compare that with his letter from his Eranos talk published in the 1970s as on the language of God, on the name of God and the source of language, there he has explained which one happened. Now it's interesting, I think he was not ultimately historically correct on this. He says there, language has been fully evacuated of its divinity, and only the poets understand the power of language anymore. Everyone else has forgotten the power of language. And so from that youthful sort of fear, but also that kind of excitement of the volcanic nature of language, the older Scholem, I think, is reflecting on the process that he has watched unfold over those 4.5 decades. we ourselves, I think, find ourselves in a somewhat different situation. Language has not been totally evacuated of meaning, but it has certainly become debased into kinds of rhetoric. And the world of Facebook and the world of email and the world of the cheapness of words has meant that we have a very different relationship to language. We're surrounded by letters, but not in the sense that the Mageed would have us, in which the world is saturated with divinity, but we're surrounded with the letters that he would say are the letters of the klipot in a certain sense. Now, rather than allowing ourselves to be rather than allowing ourselves to be demoralized by that, I would say the task that the Mageed would have is that we have to look at the language around us and uplift it, to transform it with that kind of vital intentionality that we can each bring to it.
Great. Okay, it's beautiful. To end with one question before if there are questions from the people here, well, obviously we'll have time for that. But my last question has to do with the relevance of the Mageed today, which you've touched on just now, but I want to put it in a specific context. I think for today, there's been quite an explosion last few years of comparison of, in general, religion and mysticism and Kabbalah and Hasidism with various trends in psychology and psychiatry and psychoanalysis. I'd say in Israel already becoming almost a new sub-branch of Kabbalistic studies is Kabbalah and psychoanalysis. And this perhaps sound a little bit provocative, but as the people who know that towards the end of his life, in a famous interview, Jung told the person interviewing him that really all of his theories of his type of psychology had been anticipated by the Mageed of Mezrich in the late 18th century, which I think for most people hearing that is astounding. And but given the centrality today of, with all the reservations, but of a lot of Jungian psychology, psychoanalysis. Recently, we just saw published his student Erich Neumann's writings on Hasidism, which were unpublished for 80 years, finally being published now. And someone just wrote a thesis about it, Ruven Kruger, and there's a lot going on in this field. How would you understand what Jung said, and more importantly, to sum things up, what is the relevance of the Mageed for us today from either a psychological, philosophical, theological perspective?
Yeah, I myself am drawn more in the world of religious philosophy or philosophy of religion than in psychology or psychoanalysis. However, Scholem already noted the possibility of the Mageed, and Horowitz, his student, developed this even further, that the Mageed speaks about something called Kadmuta Seichel, or the sort of primordial mind, the pre-cognizant mind, the pre-intellective mind, and of course the temptation there is to describe it as the unconscious. Now, it's not totally wrong to describe that there. It's a kind of, it's the stage even before the alphabet soup of language from which all thoughts before they've entered into concrete structures take on, and the way in which you transform things, whether they're physical things or parts of yourself, for the Mageed is that you take it back to its source. You lift it up to its source and you take it back to its source in order to rearrange it. One of his students, Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin, has it as the vidui, the way in which we, it's timely, we account for our sins by confessing them. He reads it as yodui. You take it back to the original yud, which is to say to chokhmah, to the original font of all language, and you take that character trait, whatever it may be that you're trying to work on, whether it's a tendency toward pride or anger or whatever it is, and try and get to the root, and rather than suppressing it, you uplift it, transform it, ennoble it, and allow it to come forward in different ways. I think that it's a very exciting new field, or rather an old field. It's been going on for at least 150 years, these debates, specifically in the context of Hasidism. But it is, it's one that requires some caution, because there is always a tendency to try and look back into the earlier sources and either say, oh, look, we have this in our tradition and it's really, really deep and maybe it's even better than what you have elsewhere. There are key differences, and I would say that those should also be accented as well. And that the real goal would be to put those sources into creative dialogue with these early Hasidic teachings and think about what might emerge from not an attempt to efface the differences, but rather to create a conversation between them. Charles Taylor, the famous philosopher, describes human beings as the language animal. Now, it's Charles philosopher and it's every other philosopher going back to Aristotle, but the insight is true. We are defined by our linguistic capabilities. And Abraham Joshua Heschel, in a different way, I believe this is from the 1960s, argued that the Renaissance or the renewal of humanity is a renewal of language. And this is a message he carried all the way into the 1970s until his death. This was one of the key factors that he saw, and that had to do with civil rights, and that had to do with Jewish-Christian relationships. It had to do with a lot of things. But the renewal of exactly. And so the renewal of the debasement of language and the debasement of one's experience therein, and the ability to find words after that, it is for Heschel, you might say, axiomatic to the human condition that because we are speaking beings, that's where our keys to renewal are found. And I think the Mageed did understand that language is one of the great qualities of the human being. It's one easily misused, and once misused, difficult to heal, but it's one that he never gives up on. The power of words as something that can bind us to the world around us, that can link us to other human beings, and ultimately it's the power of language that can serve us as a bridge between us and the infinite beyond.
Thank you. Okay. I'd like to again thank Professor Mayse for being with us. Fascinating and inspiring discussion for me, certainly. And I'm going to turn over now back to the chair, back to my colleague, Doron Levino. I want to thank for facilitating this whole event. And if there are questions from the audience, he'll be able to address them to Ariel to address.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yes, there are a few questions. Yehudis asked, could ambivalence regarding the world be related to a seminal teaching from Rabbi Shneur Zalman, a prime student of the Mageed, regarding language in Torah or Parshat Mishpatim, that Torah language is compared to rocks, divine-made, and other languages compared to bricks, human-made? Implication seems to be that Kavanah in brick language can bring closer or further to Elokut.
Amazing question. So to answer that on one foot, Tali Lowenthal, actually, who's an amazing scholar, has written about that passage, and I've written about it as well. It's a great passage, and it's a really important one. The Mageed has a huge influence on the Baal HaTanya, on Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi's theory of language, such that if you read the opening chapters of Sha'arei Yichud Ve'emunah from the Tanya, the second part, which is really all about language and about creation and contemplation, he quotes that in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, but it's almost certainly a tradition that he got from the Mageed. It's almost certainly a tradition that he got from the Mageed, perhaps in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, perhaps not, but it's something that he understood to be as the sort of central message of Hasidism. I think that there is more ambivalence in Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and this is something that separates him from others in the Mageed circle, toward the sanctification of ordinary languages, or perhaps better, I would say, the inherent sanctity of those languages. You find a broader or more expansive definition of other languages and sanctity as sanctified in Rabbi Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl and in others. But what's so interesting about that passage that you've pointed out is that there are things that are inherently hard, which is to say there are things that are inherently divine. And then his beautiful description of language as something that ordinary language, meaning non-Hebraic or non-Yiddish languages, that you bring into a particular area, the sort of echo chamber of the heart. And the image that he draws out there is that just as bricks are fired in a kiln, so must other languages be fired with the passion and the flames of one's inner world and one's inner desire. And it's that that transforms them into intrasacred speech. And in that, I think he is very much of a cloth with others in the Mageed's circle who understand that while Hebrew is itself inherently sanctified, although it can be misused and it can be debased and it can be used for problematic purposes or debased and undivine purposes, the other languages are ready and waiting to be uplifted and transformed. All it takes is that kind of fiery intentionality to forge them anew.
Thank you very much. There are many thanks and compliments in the chat as well. Linda says, thank you, wonderful speaker and inspiring information. Gabrielle said, the term, the power of language will remain in my thinking for a long time now after this wonderful talk in a new way. Thank you so much. And there are more and more. I'll be sure to send you the chat transcripts so that you can read them. Claudia had a comment. She says, echoes of Gershom Scholem's dialogue on language and translation with Walter Benjamin. And then Joel reacted to that saying, that observation was said expressly by Ariel in his interview with Alan Brill, which was published yesterday on Brill's blog and posted on Facebook, the Scholem Benjamin observation. There are more comments on that issue. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Sure, it's a really interesting and important one. So, Scholem has this amazing and beautiful theory of language that, again, he spelled out already in the 1920s, and he wanted to write his dissertation about theories of language in the Kabbalah, as he would say it, and decides to write about the Bahir and creates a critical edition of it. Fine, and that then becomes his life work, is spelling out the linguistic theory of the Kabbalah. It is probably something that had to do with his own personality, but it also had to do with an essay that he read in the 1910s, probably shortly after it was written, probably 1916 or 17. Scholem reads Benjamin's essay, not The Task of the Translator, but a less famous but equally repercussive one on language of such and on the language of man. And this really posits that this essay by Benjamin posits that all human language is a translation of that ineffable divine language. It obviously has echoes in his famous Task of the Translator essay. And Scholem is kind of electrified by that. Scholem is, I think his thinking is really shaped by that. Now, what's so interesting is then he doesn't quite apply that, neither he nor Rivka Schatz apply that paradigm to Hasidism, which means that they miss some really important things. But it's also interesting where they got that paradigm. They get that paradigm. Both Benjamin and Scholem in their writings refer to a perhaps less popular these days 18th century German romantic philosopher Johann Georg Hamann, and they both refer to him in his footnotes. In their footnotes, Hamann was a Christian Kabbalist. Hamann was deeply influenced by medieval Kabbalah. So what you find is this kind of interesting circuitous development in which the Kabbalists have a theory of language that Hamann gets. Hamann passes it on to Scholem, to Benjamin and to Scholem, who then reread the Kabbalistic tradition in light of that. But they can't quite bring themselves to apply it to Hasidism. And in some sense, my book is an attempt to set that right.
Thank you very much. There's a sweet exchange here between Alice and Michael. Alice wrote, does President Trump do this speaking on different levels, a universal message where each takes away what they wish to hear? And then Michael answered her, Alice, I imagine this kind of language wouldn't be self-serving and divisive. So that was sweet. And then there's a request for a book. Just a second. Is there a book that you can recommend that introduces a person to the sanctity of language?
It's a great question. If you're looking for secondary sources, I might start with Heschel's God in Search of Man, or his writings on prayer. And if you're looking for a primary source, I think that the writings that Menachem Kallis put together in the Pillar of Prayer, both in Hebrew and in English, from the Baal Shem Tov on, and the school of the Baal Shem Tov on prayer, is an incomparable resource.
Thank you very much. Claudia asks, what possible rituals could the Mageed have devised to counter the debasement of language in this era of fake news and social media?
Unhooking, in the sense that the Mageed, one of the traditions we have from the Mageed, from one of his disciples, is that he would take time every day to focus on a particular midah. Each one of the 6 days of the week, he would focus on one of the different midot, or one of the character traits. And he said he would take as much time as it took to really work on that. And he would take a break from his Talmud Torah in order to devote himself to that avodat midot. And one of the lessons of the Mageed is turning away from external stimuli, not permanently, and not because language is something that we need to turn our backs upon, but in order to develop a rich inner world, in order to develop a rich inner relationship with language, that is not something that can be imposed from the outside. It's not something that can be even transferred from one person to another. It's something that one must do for themselves. So I think, were I thinking for the Mageed, and I would hesitate to do so, because if he walked into this room, I'd be hiding under the table, I think I would say that he would have us turn away from those external stimuli, which, like in Bialik's famous essay, Gilui V'Kisui Belashon, Balashon, however you want to understand it, we paper over the abyss that surrounds us with words, and we forget that that bridge is but transient, and we try and sort of put our fingers in the holes rather than really accepting the complexity of our world. And in a world in which there's always more stimulus, in which there's always more language, in which there are always more words, it is so hard to remember to turn inward. Now, the other thing that the Mageed would remind us is that's not a way of turning, that's not a mode of turning away from other people. Because sometimes you sit together in silence. And always the turn inward is for the sake of turning outward to reconnect with other human beings, but to do so in a more genuine, present, and uplifted manner.
Thank you very much. Susan asks, as children, we're invited to say the magic word, maybe abracadabra. We later learn that this comes from Evrakadabra, sorry for that translation. It makes me think of Tolkien's speak, friend, and enter, the magic invocational power of the right word. Does this figure in the Mageed's teaching about language?
Can I interject before Ariel answers? I'll just reframe that a bit broader. It didn't come up, but is there a magical component to the Mageed's theory of language, apropos of the question?
Yeah, definitely. Yosef Weiss put his finger on that. The contemplative theory of the Mageed's, Mageed's contemplative theory of magic. And I think that Moshe Idel in his many, many studies has really underscored that dimension, whether we call it magical or talismanic. There are different ways of talking about it. The answer is yeah, that part of it is there in the Mageed's legacy. It's there in the Baal Shem Tov's legacy for sure, and it's there in the world that they were a part of. The magical property of language was evident, and in some ways it was almost self-evident. However, there's this really interesting moment in the introduction to Mageed of Rav Yaakov, which is the first book published in the name of the Mageed, where the editor of that book presents a transcription or presents an account of a conversation that he has with the Mageed about what the Mageed studied with the Baal Shem Tov, and he studied two very, you might say, off the beaten path books of medieval Kabbalah, Ma'ayana Chochmah, and Raziel Malach, which for those who are interested in Kabbalah are really important, but it's not what you would think of in terms of like the most important things you would study with your teacher. You'd learn Eitz Chaim, right? Would be a manuscript then, but you would learn something from the Lurianic corpus, or you'd learn Zohar or something like that. And those are books that are deeply magical in their understanding of language. Raziel Malach actually has, at least in some printings, angelic scripts that this is what the language of the angels would have looked like had you written it out. And so Shlomo Vlutsk, who's the author of this introduction, says, so can you do this kind of magic as well? Can you do this? And the Mageed says you need a lot of Yehudim to be able to do this, and it it seems fairly clear that he is either consciously or unconsciously turning away from that kind of magical modality of the Besht, such that there is at least one disciple who is said to have gone, have left the circle of the Mageed and the Mageed's disciples and gone to the circle of the Mageed and of the Zlochov, who is a different Mageed, a different preacher, precisely because he wanted to understand how to do miracles. And he wanted that part of the legacy of the Baal Shem Tov, which he wasn't going to get in Mezrich. So the adage of Chabad that there were miracles in Mezrich, but they were rolling under the table and people were too busy learning on top of the table is in some ways important to keep in mind, that the magical properties of language are there. But what the Mageed says is that when you go to Kadmuta Seichel, where you go to the place that is beyond everything, miracles can be accomplished, visions can be seen, but that's not the point. Those happen, memela is the way that he describes them. They happen organically, they happen on their own, but it's not simply because you're chasing them down. I think what the Mageed would say is that the most important thing that you can say to other people is any word that is filled with your kind of intentional presence. It's the words that are spoken bechavana that porchim la'el. They are the ones that have wings and take flight. Words that don't have that, don't.
Thank you so much. There are a few more questions, but mainly thanks and compliments and wonderful feelings expressed in the chat room. I'll definitely send you the transcript. Thank you very much. Gmar Chatima Tova. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Just nothing specific. I would like to again wish all the participants Shana Tova, Mituka, very sweet and very healthy and happy year. Gmar Chatima Tova. I wish a very happy Sukkot. Hopefully not, and maybe you can get to see other people, which would be very beautiful and I think important in light of the community issues that were discussed here. And I'd like to again thank both Ariel and Doron and all the participants for taking the time to join us in this very, very special, intellectually and spiritually stimulating discussion.
Thank you,
Look forward to reading Ariel's books.
Thank you, Zvi. And thank you to all who came and I see many of my friends and teachers here. It's a real honor to see you and thank you so much for coming.
Great, really appreciate it. This was very meaningful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A beautiful talk.
Thank you very much. Really amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
תודה רבה, מצוין.
בשמחה, תודה לך.
תודה, שנה טובה.
Toda Rabbi. Thank you.
להתראות.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Ariel. It was. I have a bibliographical question that I'd like to know what you think of the various books that have been published, such as Kitvei Kodesh, Shamua Tova, and most recently Dibrot HaMagid, that purportedly come from the school of Reb Levi Yitzchak.
Yeah.
The fact that there's so much overlap and difference between and additions that that each one of those have that others don't. What do you make of that apparent mishmash?
I mean, that's what it is. It's a mishmash. And I think that the thesis of Levi Yitzchak being the sort of scribe of the Mageed school really needs to be revisited. His name appears halfway through some of the manuscripts, not in other parts. And Shema Tova is a good example because Shema Tova has stuff that probably comes from the Mageed. I think that there's stuff in the early parts of it that come from the Mageed. There are close parallels to elsewhere in the corpus. But there's a lot of stuff there that is from 1773 or on. There are actually dated things in Shema Tova that clearly come from Levi Yitzchak, and you can find almost exact parallels to other parts of Levi Yitzchak's corpus. But what's so interesting is that they tend to be much shorter and clearer in the later developments as opposed to the young sort of Melitz Levi Yitzchak. Kitvei Kodesh is a mishmash. There's a lot of stuff in there, and some of it belongs to the Mageed, and a lot of it belongs to others. Dibrot HaMagid is a really interesting issue because it's a great resource. I mean, it's amazing that it's there. Unfortunately, the editors made the decision to chop it up and rework it so that it goes according to the Parsha as opposed to what the manuscript could have been. They could have published the entire manuscript, and we could have been able to think through which parts of this belong to what, and which parts of this may be older, which parts may be younger, which parts may belong to Levi Yitzchak, and which may belong to other scribes that got stuck together, because we have accounts of many different people having taken down the Mageed's teachings. And
Shmua Tova, though, is a very interesting example. It was said to have been written down between 1773 and 75.
Yeah.
And it comes from a very good library, the library of Emmett.
Yeah.
What would you make of, let's say, the kavanot of Tkiyat Shofar attributed to the Baal Shem Tov, which are not paralleled anywhere else?
Yeah. I mean, I think you know more about that than I do. What do you think about them? No one knows more about this than you.
I'm tempted. I'm very tempted to say it's the Baal Shem Tov.
Yeah.
But,
I'm inclined to lean in that same direction, which is that A, the lineage of the manuscript, and B, the fact that like the other stuff in that really checks out. Like there's stuff that checks out from the Mageed, there's stuff that clearly there is the hand of Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. I would be surprised if that manuscript, unlike other texts that were printed or published later where there was this vested interest in getting sort of like neo-beshed materials in there to sell it, like I don't think that's what happened there. I would be tempted in the same way that you are. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Gemar Chatima Tova.
Gemar Chatima Tova. Thank you.